Hi, stream.
Yep. I'm ready. Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. When it was released, yeah. Correct. Mhm. Yeah, the so I was approached by a publisher with a suggestion that I should compile it into a book. Actually, I had been asked quite a few times uh, before then if I ever planned to turn the blog into a book, and every single time I said no. And it wasn't until I was approached that I really took that idea seriously. But what I did is I took all the information on the blog relating to creatures from the Monster Manual and then filled it out with the Monster Manual that I had not looked at yet. And so made sort of a parallel volume to the Monster Manual, basically. And in the process, my editor, who is also a fifth edition D&D player, and a very sharp guy, helped me um, find mistakes, work out some of the things that had been a little rough the first time or unclear or where I had actually just kind of gotten something wrong. And we revised those parts. And my wife, who is a very talented artist, did the illustrations for me. And yeah, and we produced what you hold in your hands.
Okay,
Nice.
great.
And I know,
Oh, Tracy?
and we quick. I was just gonna say, Jeff, we quickly talked about your experience with D&D, but
Oh,
maybe it makes sense to go. Keith, what is your experience with Dungeons and Dragons?
My experience is I date back to AD&D, and that was the first edition I played. I had the Holmes Blue Box set. That was the first. That was the first D&D product I ever held in my hands. But I didn't really have a group of people to play with until mid to late high school, and the people I was playing with then were playing full on AD&D. So I jumped into the pool with both feet and went away to college, continued to play right about until the time second edition came out. And concurrent with that, I started drifting away from D&D and more into Shadowrun, which had just come out at that time. And so when I returned to fantasy role playing, at that time, the people I was playing with were no longer playing D&D. They were so that was the system I played for a while, fifth edition. My wife asked me to DM a group for her and some of her coworkers, and I went out and got the fifth edition starter set, and pretty quickly realized that the game had been overhauled in some pretty dramatic ways. And so I got the player's handbook and the dungeon master's guide, and then I really began to appreciate what the developers had done with D&D in the fifth edition, and it appeals to me a lot. I really like how streamlined it has been relative to the previous editions that I played. I really like how very internally consistent it is, and how systematic the developers have been in how they write the rules. They take a very legalistic approach, which is the best possible approach for a game that has so many rules lawyers in it. And yeah, it's just I've just been continually impressed by how the game is being managed right now, and how fifth edition built on the foundation of the past editions of the
Yeah,
game.
no, it feels like it's sort of hit a sweet spot. You talk about this legalistic approach, and having played through
And I don't mean that as a
no,
pejorative
absolutely.
at all.
Having
To me, that is a compliment that they have. It's almost Talmudic how it is. How they've written it so that everything is to be interpreted absolutely
yeah.
literally. That was a very smart move, in my
Yeah, and I
opinion.
think having played I started in second edition AD&D, um, and it was a lot less so, a lot more open to interpretation at that time. Third edition
Mhm.
seemed to ratchet up the no, we need to be clear because we've had a decade or so now of people arguing over things,
Mhm.
and then to my mind, fourth edition cranked it up to 11, which is what probably turned a lot of people off of fourth edition because it became so legalistic. It kind of lost the for some people it kind of lost the story, right? It lost the fantasy, world building and all that. So I think fifth edition has hit this interesting sweet spot where things are evocative, but mechanically it has enough of that legalese in it that it's very clear, right?
Mhm.
Yeah. And I thought, and that's why I wanted to bring up the experience that Keith has had, because like our listeners know I started with fourth edition, but my brother played those earlier editions, and I sat in and listened to a lot of his games, and there was a lot of arguing, to be honest, about what things meant or which things should be able to happen and stuff like that. So I remember a lot of that, and I don't mean it in a bad way. They absolutely loved it. It was a great experience for them. But reading the book, I was both brought back to that time in my life, and then thinking through with fourth and fifth edition how it has changed, and become, like I think you said a few times, more streamlined in the book. And then I love the parts where you point out how sometimes uh, they didn't necessarily pay quite as much attention to detail, perhaps, in some of the, like, the monsters, like the things that they're allowed to do don't actually fully match the flavor text, which is fine. It's not necessarily a huge knock. It's just then you have to figure out what that means.
Right. And to build on what you just said, the fact that it was a great experience for those players doesn't necessarily mean it was a great experience for everybody. There were no doubt a lot of players who had trouble with that style of play. And fifth edition in is kind of simultaneously stricter but also kinder. It understands how many people are playing this game for the narrative experience and for the experience of walking in someone else's shoes for a while, as well as the people who want a nice, structured, predictable, way that certain things are going to play out. It's interesting to me how much more tightly rule governed combat is in fifth edition relative to the other two declared pillars of gameplay, social interaction and exploration. Uh, and I'm sure that it's because they've found out that that's where the most arguments break out. That when people are in social interaction or environmental exploration modes, they are much more comfortable with things being free form. But when their hit points are on the line, they want everything just so.
Right. Yeah, I think like a story that hits on that I've heard a lot of people who've kind of throw about has to go back to like playing quote unquote war in your neighborhood. Nobody cares. Everyone cared about whether or not you hit when you're like playing with water guns or something like that. Whereas like how long it took to get up the hill, people didn't really care about that as much, or like whether or not you really had a particular piece of flavor on you, matches or something like that in pretend world. So I think that adds to that, right? Because like that's what people like. I don't want my character to die. That's the thing that I care most about. Having rules to protect me. Everything else we can negotiate out.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So Tracy had alluded earlier, and I think it's interesting, this idea that sometimes you do this mechanical analysis of a creature and point out that what the mechanics suggest the creature should be doing is not what the flavor text describes as the way the creature works. And I think it's
Yeah, it doesn't happen a lot, but it
yeah, I
does
think it's
happen.
worth then asking. So what are sort of the premises? What are the foundational sort of assumptions that you make when you design these strategies? Where does that come from? So if not the flavor text, what?
The number one foundational assumption is that this is the game setting is a universe that is governed not by our natural laws of physics and biology and chemistry and so forth, but by the rules of the game. And there are creatures that live in this universe, and they are living beings that seek to perpetuate their own existence and the existence of their species, and that they have learned over generations instinctively the best ways to ensure their survival within that set of rules, within that universe. And so they are not going to use their particular adaptations, in other words, their features and traits and special actions, in suboptimal ways. They are going to use them to their best effect. Now, that's the general statement. There are some caveats to that, such as a creature with very low intelligence is going to be less flexible, have less independent judgment, less ability to assess things outside its experience. And so if its normal way of acting, the way of acting that's optimal for 80% of the situations it encounters in its off-screen life, stop working, it's not going to know what else to do. Whereas a very, very intelligent creature, such as a lich, a mind flayer, they're going to be very adaptive, very quick on the draw, and have lots of different ideas about how to handle an unexpected situation. But in general, every creature is adapted to its own way of life and is the expert in using its own features and traits. And then everything else grows out of that.
So and that's where the mechanical sort of features and traits and stat block and that kind of stuff takes precedence in some ways to your thinking over the flavor text.
Right. There are also a couple of things I do with respect to ability scores. I use the ability scores as a way of deciding what a creature's style is, for lack of a better word. I look for a main offensive ability and a main defensive ability. And so if those are, for example, strength and constitution, I conclude for that that this is a melee brawler. It's a tank that is going to go in, try to do as much damage as it can at close range, and it's going to be tough enough to tank out the fight and keep fighting until it wins most of the time. My shorthand term for that is a brute. Anytime I refer to something as a brute, I'm talking about that ability contour with peaks in strength and constitution for a creature that favors melee engagement. But not every creature is like that. And so if you're not really thinking about what all your creatures are like and what their comparative advantages are, you're going to end up with a lot of creatures that just run in and claw, 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 and stab, 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 and whatever, until they die. And those kinds of fights are typical of a game in which the DM has not really thought a lot about how things are supposed to work, or simply gets overwhelmed in the moment, and they get boring. They get samey, and creatures are not differentiated from one another adequately. So I am very big into verisimilitude. That's sort of my own adaptation from playing with one friend in particular who has just a wildly creative imagination. I don't have that kind of creativity that he has, but I think I'm pretty good at making the situations I do create feel very real. And so that's what I try to play to with these things. And really try to make every encounter feel like a unique experience.
Yeah, and you certainly have a style of play and an analysis that I find interesting, right? Because there is a style of playing D&D wherein every fight is a fight to the death, right? But you describe
Yeah.
very few such creatures wherein every fight is a fight to the death. Most creatures have a threshold where it's like, okay, no, I'm out, you know.
Yeah, almost all creatures want to live. The exceptions are undead and fanatics, basically. Undead, fanatics, and that are accustomed to a primitive, traditional kind of combat in which prisoners are not taken. Prisoners are just executed, so being captured means dying. If you believe in your heart of hearts that being captured means dying, then you are going to fight to the death. But if you think you can live to fight another day, you're going to do that. And if you look at the natural world, predators that go up against prey that fights back don't keep trying to bring down that prey. They get out of there and go after something easier. So yeah, I don't think most creatures, given a choice, will fight to the death. I think that they will fight until they recognize that they are bested, and then they will get out of there by whatever means suits them the best.
And I think this.
Oh, go ahead.
I was gonna say it brings up a question though in your games, because some people end up playing with this belief that if you don't kill the creature, you don't get the XP. Did that come up in your games?
I personally,
okay, yeah, no, I
do that. Yeah.
yeah.
No, to me, if you confront and win the encounter, you get the XP. It doesn't matter whether you won it by killing the creature or simply by clearing the blockage. If your only objective was to get through a certain area and the monster there was merely an obstacle to you getting through that area, if you can do what it takes to get through that area, you did it. You succeeded. There's no reason to penalize that by reducing XP. Um, Now, if all you did was circumvent it in a way that left the problem for you or someone else to deal with later, then I usually give only half. But as long as you actually achieved the greater objective of the encounter, yeah, I award full XP for that. I personally have a mild moral problem with um, with incentivizing killing everything you confront by only awarding XP for kills. That's not something I want to do. I definitely want my players to show mercy when they can, to use clever solutions to circumvent a combat solution when that opportunity presents itself, and so forth. I definitely don't want to encourage the murder hobo mindset. Um, but I also want combat to feel like there are stakes. You know, I rail against the stereotype of the dungeon master as wanting to kill their players. I think if you fundamentally on your player's side, you should let someone else be the DM. I am always rooting for my players, but at the same time, I want to give them challenges that are tough enough that they feel satisfied by the victory. Because nobody really likes a pushover victory. What they want is to be challenged and then to prevail.
Yeah.
And so the tougher the challenge, as long as they have that chance to prevail, the better, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, I know. Even if, and maybe you can speak to sort of how you imagine people using the book, right? But to my mind, there's a few things going on. One, as sort of somebody who's reading it cover to cover, I absorb a way of thinking about running my encounters, right? And that's, I think, meaningful. But then I also think there's a use case for it of, okay, I'm about to run a session and I expect them to run into this monster. Let me see if it's in there and pick up some strategies, right?
And that's actually my primary intended use case, because that's what I started writing the
Right.
blog for. The blog was an echo of my own thoughts when I was trying to prepare myself to do these things, to run these sessions. And there were two aspects to that. One is to make sure that I'm capturing the right flavor of the creature and using the creature in the most appropriate way. The other is to reduce my decision making during the game session itself, because the more decisions you have to make under pressure when you're dividing your cognitive load among many different tasks, as dungeon masters are always doing, the worse decisions you make. So the more decisions you can make beforehand, the more simple rules you can give yourself for evaluating a situation so that you can make a decision on the fly when you have to, the fewer of those decisions you have to make during the session itself. And so the lower your cognitive load and the more smoothly things are going to go. Everyone wants their combat ideally to be high speed, low drag. Nobody likes analysis paralysis, and from other players or themselves or the DM. And so when you can kind of get into a zone and let things progress smoothly with a minimum of dead air, that's the ideal.
No, absolutely. Yeah, that's always been my, I talked at the beginning about how I struggle as a DM to run encounters effectively, and a lot of it is because my sense of narrative and wanting things to just move quickly is greater than my sense of I want to, run things optimally, right? So I think it's good to, part of me, after reading the book, I'm like, oh, now I need to prep for my next session. I wish there was like a worksheet or like, create one of those analog maps or whatever.
I really wanted to make flowcharts
Yeah.
for everything. I just never find the software to do it. And of course, obviously, it would not have fit in the book at all. But when I first started writing the blog, I really was like, man, I wish I could just put flowcharts with these
Well,
things and make it. But no, that was something that never came to
it's
fruition, unfortunately.
it particularly,
I don't know if it is unfortunate
well,
because it might not have turned into a book if I had done that.
yeah.
So
Well, it would work better in the book than it does in the audiobook, which is how I've mostly consumed it. So,
yeah, that I imagine. Well, because it's not searchable, so I
Right.
can imagine that would be pretty tough.
Although it's set up nicely, so they've set up the chapters by creature. So if I want to listen to, oh, how do I run Vampire Spawn, I can just jump straight to that chapter and listen, which I did. I re-listened to it last week before I ran my session because I was going to have the players don't realize it, but their first encounter with Strahd
Okay.
in disguise fighting some vampire spawn, and I got myself into that headspace that from reading the book. I got myself into that headspace. Okay, but what's the purpose here? Like, they don't actually want to win. They're there to make this person look like they're being under threat, right? So now the players feel for this person. They come to the rescue, but secretly it's Strahd in disguise, right? So that whole encounter only needed to last a couple of rounds just to make the point, and then, oh no, we've been blasted, run away, whatever it is. So no, it was useful way of thinking about that. So we talked about sort of the basic foundation premise of your analysis, your strategizing, and some of the other things there's other things that have sort of come out as you've talked as well. And I think one of the things that hasn't come up as much is it seems like your sense of how combat is run is mostly assuming mapped out combat, right? Because you're talking about they can move this distance, and you're talking about flanking, using the optional flanking rules and that kind of stuff, which assumes that you're not running theater of the mind. Is that accurate?
It's about 80% accurate. I use a battle map myself. I use gridded combat. I do occasionally use. I actually, for me, it is about 80-20. It's about 80% on the grid, 20% theater of the mind. I tend to use theater of the mind for combat encounters that are looser, that are less terrain dependent, that have less of an impact on how things are going to play out beyond the end of that encounter. There's really nothing in what I write that doesn't apply at all to theater of the mind, except that, of course, when you are playing theater of the mind, you're interpreting certain things more loosely, like ranges. The basic combat heuristics don't really change. You're just you're just a little bit looser about how you interpret them. And of course, flanking no longer comes into play because flanking, the optional rule, is only an option when you're playing gridded combat. Apply to theater of the mind. So yeah, then you can't use that. But generally speaking, it's grid oriented, but it's not grid dependent.
I think that's fair. So you've got a lot of creatures in the book, but the monster manual is large, and there's other books as well full of monsters now that didn't come out when the book when 5th edition originally came out. So how do you make the decision about what to include and what not to include in this book?
Well, like I said before, the book, The Monsters Know What They're Doing, was developed specifically to parallel the monster manual. So there is nothing in the book that is in a book other than the monster manual. There are no creatures from Volos or Mordenkainen's in The Monsters Know What They're Doing, the book. And I tried to be relatively complete with respect to how many of the monsters from the monster manual that I looked at. There were some omissions. I didn't do just basic animals. There were a couple of creatures like the troglodyte is one that are so simplistic they don't even bear mention. There is no, you can run a troglodyte completely on autopilot. You don't need me to tell you what to do. There was one little omission that I'm kind of kicking myself for after the fact, and I on the blog I tied up that thread in NPC Tactics Scout and Spy. I wish I had realized that those two were missing from the book and included them. But other than that, I tried to be pretty thorough in making sure that all of the important monsters from the monster manual were included. And on the blog, I am this close to finally wrapping up my examination of creatures in Volos. And then I'm going to do what I can to wrap up Mordenkainen's. And after that, probably move on to Eberron. That's my plan.
Okay.
Some people have asked me whether I'm going to look at stuff from Tome of Beasts or from Jewel Adventures. And my answer to that is I want to try to get the core WotC books that more people are going to have and get those things done before I start going off in other directions.
Okay.
So you just mentioned potentially doing Eberron. And maybe this is not a great question, but have you thought about how that world changes? Maybe the way that you look at the ability scores and stuff like that at all?
I haven't looked at that yet.
Okay.
When I get to that, then I'll look and see whether any of the approach is necessary. But I imagine that on the whole, probably not a lot will change.
Yeah. I was just
technology
curious.
doesn't change evolution. It's just another thing that you evolve in response to.
Right. And that's where I was wondering, like, just the fact, particularly for humanoids, that magic is a little more commonplace with that. But yeah.
Well, and there's also the fact that Eberron is built around an assumption that alignment is not necessarily assigned by genetics, right? So just because you're a chromatic dragon doesn't mean you're evil in Eberron like it does in the rest of D&Ds. So I suppose that might change the mindset of the creature as well. There was several creatures that you sort of discuss, not often, but every now and then you'll have a creature where the alignment impacts the tactics, right? I was just recently going through the Celestial section, for example, and Celestials, of course, are a lot more likely to pull their punches because they're not trying to kill people. That's not their motivation.
Right. Yeah. Or if you look at a lawful neutral monster like I think Myconids are lawful neutral. Modrons are lawful neutral. They are not looking to. They're not looking to kill you. They're looking to quell a disturbance. And so if they can quell a disturbance in a non-violent way, they will do it. If violence is required, they will do it. Or a chaotic neutral character, not necessarily malicious, It's just reckless. And so a chaotic neutral monster like a Slod, a lot of the violence that it's going to do is collateral. It's not necessarily inspired by hostility. If you encounter it, it might not be hostile at all, just indifferent. But yeah, once you get into a setting in which um, alignment is more variable, then you are going to have a little more variability in those approaches. Um, but now, again, I haven't looked at a lot of those stat blocks yet, so I don't know if any of those stat blocks say something like any evil alignment or any alignment tending lawful or anything like that, or if they just say lawful neutral, neutral evil, what have you. Um, I would tend to follow what the stat block says. And if the setting says there are exceptions, then that's simply an asterisk appended to everything.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, no.
You know, and if the baseline member of a species is neutral evil, then what I'm giving you is the baseline tactic. And it might vary by individual.
Right, absolutely. I think that's fair. Tracy, do you have any other thoughts or questions?
I think that's it for
Okay.
now.
Then I need to go to the big takeaway for me is that my biggest failing as a DM running monsters is I'm not paying enough attention to spells and specifically which ones can be cast as a bonus action and which ones can be upgraded with to higher slots. So I need to go through my monster manual and just jot in little notes for every single spell in every stat block, I think, just to give me a quick shorthand. So thank you for making me think of that. So.
You almost have to. Having a spell repertoire complicates a creature's tactics by an order of magnitude.
It's,
Because then you're not just comparing a set of 5 or 6 features with one another. Now, on top of those 5 or 6 features, you've got 3 or 5 or 10 or 12 spells, and every spell has to be evaluated against every other spell. And it really, it really is a time suck. And I always kind of grit my teeth a little bit before diving into any creature with a large spell repertoire. Um, but knowing which ones enhance a creature's action economy is very, very important because that is bonus actions are gold. In a situation in a rule set where everyone gets movement, everyone gets an action, but some creatures get bonus actions and others don't. That fact in and of itself makes bonus actions extremely valuable. And anytime you can take one, you'd almost be crazy not to.
absolutely.
Entire strategies are built around things grant bonus actions or that impose certain conditions that confer advantage, like restrained, prone, stunned, paralyzed is far and away the biggest one.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's one of the things that I think fourth edition made really easy because stat blocks, like there were no just list of spells. If a creature had spells, there was a little block that had the description of exactly what it did and what kind of action it was. It was real easy. For all of its flaws and strengths, that was one of the strengths I think that made life easier. But every other edition does it like fifth edition, right? Here's the list of spells, and now it's like okay, but I don't have all those spells memorized. I've been playing a long time, but I don't have all those spells memorized. So I think it's going to be crucial for me to figure out how to look at that more carefully as I run my games. So thank you for reminding me in my head that that's something I need to think more about. So. Then in that case, I think I just want to thank you for joining us, and I want to point people to where they can find you. So if they want to know more about what you're up to, where should they go?
I am active on Twitter at Keith Amman. That's my only social media account that I use. Um, the blog is themonstersknow.com. My personal website is spyandowl.com. That's one word solid, no hyphens. I will be coming out with another book on July 7th called Live to Tell the Tale, Combat Tactics for Player Characters, in which I render my restitution to all the players in the 5th edition D&D world for what I did to them, and them the tools to fight back against the smarter monsters. So that'll be out July 7th. And yeah, that's it.
Very good, yeah. Although there are a lot of places for min-maxers who are playing PCs to go out there and find optimization. I'm not worried about them. I appreciate you throwing them a bone,
Yeah,
but I'm not worried about
actually,
them.
I come out of the from the olden days where it was real men, real role players, loonies and munchkins. I come out of real role player stock. And for me, it's not about optimizing the PC. In fact, I kind of think that's a little bit gauche. It's not about mechanical optimization. It's about optimizing the behavior given the character that you have created. So the character itself does not need to be optimized. But if you want to keep that character alive, you have to candidly acknowledge what that character's strengths and weaknesses are and optimize your decision making in order to use that character
so it's
effectively.
Not about optimizing your build.
So Live to Tell the Tale is not it's not a min-maxing guide. It's a guide to decision making.
That's an interesting approach. There's a lot of people that min-max how to build a character, but you're talking about how to min-max playing the character, not building it.
So
sure, yeah, that's one way to put it.
If I got it right, it's kind of like the same type of approach you took with taking the monster stat block, or the creature stat block and the abilities they have, and extrapolating out the story from them. You're doing that now from the player side.
Nice.
Yes, that is absolutely what it is.
Great. I'm looking forward to reading that as well. So, good job. Keep up the great work, and maybe someday we'll have you on and have you hop on another advice episode where you can jump in and we can all shout back and forth at the panelists and figure some of these things out.
All right, happy
great. All right, that is where I'll stop the recording. Say goodbye to the folks in the stream, which it looks like went way better technologically. It tells me that it didn't drop a single frame, so that's positive.
All right. No people in chat kvetching about not being able to hear?
Nobody's kvetching about not being able to hear, and a few of the questions that I asked were coming from the chat. And people like your bonus action discussion. So we'll say goodbye to the chat, and then I'll shut that down.